Consider this example where we have this greeter class. It has a method find by id. Now this class has a dependency on the math_ops class. So this is accepting a reference via the constructor, and it is using the math_ops class to find out if this number is even. If this number is even, the past number is even, then it returns a string even, otherwise odd. And if we go to the math_ops class here, the is even method is defined here. It takes the number and the simple even odd logic. The thing that we want to discuss here is that in a real world project, a class has many dependencies, and the setup could be even more complicated. It's a very simple setup, but it could be more complicated. When we write the test case, the JUnit test case, we test the test unit in isolation. That means if we are writing the test case of greeter, then we want to test greeter in perfect isolation. If it has dependencies on other things, then we don't want to include, or we don't want to involve those dependencies, otherwise it would break the isolation. The target is, if we write a test case and if we run it multiple times, then every time it should run consistently and it should return the same response. But if we don't deal with such dependencies, they could change the output. Maybe instead of this math_ops, we may have some HTTP call. And what if the target server is down? What happens then? If this is a DB call and the record is no longer there, the test record that we are trying to get in the test case, it would fail. Or maybe this is another service not owned by us. Any complicated setup could be there. So the point is, if a class has such dependencies, how do we deal such dependencies while writing the test case? In such conditions, in such situations, we use mocking. When we are writing a very low level test case where we have the detailed information of the method, where we can see that yes, this dependency is used and we need to bypass it, in such cases we can use the mocking. All right, mocking basically isolate method calls where we are dependent on other libraries or some third party or any other dependency. There is a little bit of faking going on when we use the mocking. It fakes the behavior of the class on which the target class is dependent. So what we do, let me put a comment here just for the documentation. So when we use the mocking, what we do, we init a mock, then we set the expectations because we are faking the behavior. Then we run the test case and we verify the outcome. Okay, now how do we use the mocking? To do that, we will use Mockito, another library that provides the mocking capabilities. In order to use Mockito in our project, we need to add Mockito dependencies. To do that, in the POM, I have added two dependencies. One is Mockito core and second is Mockito JUnit Jupyter to work with JUnit5 as an extension. So once we have these dependencies, we are good to go if we want to use Mockito mock capabilities. So let's go to the test case. Here we see that we want to mock math_ops. So the first step is that we won't create the new object of math_ops in this way. Instead, we will create a mock object. To do that, we need to extend JUnit capabilities. JUnit5 does not support mocking capabilities on its own. It is the responsibility of Mockito, but it provides the extension so that we can extend the JUnit5 architecture or JUnit5 framework. To do that, we will use extend with annotation, and in here we can give Mockito extension.class. It means we want to extend the JUnit5 capabilities and we want to use Mockito capabilities as well. And this class is coming from the libraries that we added, Mockito libraries. Then the first step is to initialize the mock. Let's remove this line because we no longer will create the object in this way, but we will create a mock object. So we will use @mock annotation from the Mockito private math ops. So this is the mock object. This means that we will set up some expectations on this mock object in order to avoid the actual implementation or the actual dependency of the math ops in greeter class. So now we create the new mock object and we are passing this mock object to the greeter constructor. Okay, let's open the greeter inside as well here. So right now, let's try to run this code in the current state. So if we run it, it actually doesn't know what to do. Because this is a mock object, it does not know what to do. We have not set up any expectations on it, so it doesn't know how to behave, and it simply returned this as false. So that's why we see the assertion failed, expected even, but we got odd. Now, step 1 was to init the mock that we did. Step 2 is to set the expectations. How do we set the expectations? We use the Mockito library. So we say Mockito dot. Now there are several methods that we can use, like we can mock the static classes that we don't have at the moment. We can provide the matchers any, or here we say when. So this is we are going to use. We say Mockito.when. It expects a method call. So we say when we call is even on the mock object and when we pass the value 2. So it means when we call or when we trigger this method call, then you intercept this method call and return true. This is where we are setting the expectation using Mockito. We are saying that you monitor the code, and when you find a method call such like this, ops.isEven with the argument 2, then you need to return true. Okay, now if we run the code, we see that it passed successfully, because this time when we triggered find by ID and it reached to this line, it saw that this is a mock object and it found that there is an expectation set, and because this is matching ops.isEven, the input parameter was 2, so we got the true as per the expectation. Now the thing is, if we changed the expectation to false, even though we know that 2 is an even number, but we are saying if you find this method call, simply return false. It is up to us how we set up the expectations and the return value in such cases. So even though if we call this method without mocking, 2 will return true always because it is an even number, but because this is a mock object and we control the expectation, we can say that if we are passing 2, then return false. And if we run the test code with this expectation, so we should see a failure. Here it is. The test case failed because as per the expectation, now the method call is returning false, but the expectation was that we will get even value in return. That's why it failed. So the point I'm trying to show is that in case of mock object, we control the expectation and the value that we are returning. It's not the actual method call, we are faking it. So in this video, we saw how to set up, how to add the Mockito dependencies, how do we extend the JUnit5 capabilities, and how do we mock method calls. So here we are passing a single test condition, a single method call that if you see the argument true and the method being called is even, then return the value true. And if we change the value to 3, then let's see what happens now. So you see the test case failed. It says that strict stubbing argument mismatch, because the expectation that we did set up was with number 2, but here we changed the number, so it's no longer valid, it's no longer working as expected. In such cases, in certain cases, what we can do, we can pass a wildcard kind of value instead of a specific number, or maybe a string value if the target expects a string. So Mockito has different methods starting with any. So if you see, we can pass a class to any. It means any object or any value of this type. For example, in this case, we can use any int. So we are saying that if you see this method call and the argument is any integer, we don't care about the exact value. It could be any integer. So it's a wildcard. We are saying it doesn't have to be 2 or 3, but any integer. So now if we run this code with any value, let's say 6, for all the integer values, it will return true. Here it is. So just to recap, we can use any methods as a wildcard matcher for the expectations. Okay. Suppose we have an implementation like this. So instead of returning anything, the return type of the method is void. And this time we are simply printing even or odd based on the number passed to the console. So in such cases, we cannot use an assertion same as assert equals, because there is no return value. What can we do in such cases? So there is a way to test or to cover the line in such cases. First of all, we are using a mock for ops. So we did set up a expectation that if you are calling is even, then return true for any integer. Then we call the find by id, but we don't get any value in return. So how do we validate, or how do we cover the line? So we can verify if a method was invoked and how many number of times using verify. So we can verify that Mockito has a method verify. It takes a mock and a verification mode. So mock that we will pass is ops, because we will check in this case, did we call is even? That's what we want to verify. Verification mode says we are going to see that Mockito times means we will check that this method is even for any number of integer was called exactly once. So this line says that verify if is even this method of this mock was called this number of times that we are passing. Since we are passing 1, so we are saying that verify is even of ops was called exactly once with this parameter, in this case any integer. And if we run the test case, we see that it will pass. It will pass because it was called exactly once. All right, we can test other conditions as well. For example, if we simply change it to never. Never is used to test or to verify if a method was not called. All right. Although in this case it would fail, but it can be very useful in certain cases where we want to test if a method was not called. So instead of times 0, we can simply say never. So it says that it failed because it says that although it was never wanted, but it was invoked. It was invoked once. So that's how we use method verification using Mockito. We have covered almost all the details related to JUnit5 and Mockito. There are more methods present in Mockito class, but we are not going to cover all of them. It depends on the use case. We have covered important ones like verify, how do we use when, or number of times the method was called using times. At least once can be used if we are not sure exactly how many times a method would be called, but we know a least number. For example, at least once was called or at least twice. So we can say at least and pass the number 2. At least once is also there. Similarly, at most and at most once. Do nothing when when the target method is void and we want to capture that, we want to set up the expectations, we can say Mockito.do nothing depending on the expectation. Do throw can be used to throw the exceptions. So if we are using a mock and we want to throw an exception using that mock object, we can use the do throw exception. So there are lots of things in Mockito class. It would take some time to use all of them to get a hands on, but I leave that to you.